Hello, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Esoteric Literacy. Today we're going to be discussing German philosophy, the spiritual destiny of the Slavic people, and a bit of insight into the Rosicrucian stream of history. Because there are a lot of misconceptions about the so-called Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, and I would like to clarify a lot of that. Because if you go on the internet and search for anything regarding Rosicrucianism, you will be immediately misled by misinformation, garbage conspiracy theory, and mainstream historians who deny the existence of this group, of this aspect of Western civilization. So to begin with, I would just like to show you a list of Rosicrucian philosophers from Germany. This is from a book called Mystics After Modernism by Rudolf Steiner. Is that glare bad? You could pause the video and check out that list. Of course, Giordano Bruno is on that list. He was not German, but all of the others on there were German. You know, you have Meister Eckhart from the 13th century, who people still love to talk about. Agrippa of Nettesheim, of course, that's Cornelius Agrippa, who wrote those three works on occult science. You have Paracelsus, who was the famous alchemist. He changed medicine forever. Without him, the world of medicine and physicians would be not what it is today. And Jacob Boehme is on there. He's not as well known, but he was very inspired by the Holy Spirit, and he really kicked off what the spiritual, mystical essence of the Rosicrucian way of thinking is. A few other names to add to that list could be Johann Valentin André, George von Welling, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. I'll discuss who these individuals were and why they're Rosicrucians and what their importance is for the Western world. German philosophy is deeply Christian, especially regarding the Renaissance era of it. It's based on a mystic and intuitive culture that was in between orthodoxies. You know, the Germans had always had their struggles with religious institutions and have always strived to be free thinkers and individualists. And of course, there have been forces in history who have tried to destroy German individualism, and we know how that turned out in the 20th century. But there's always been a core of deep Christian feeling in the world of German philosophy and science. The philosopher who really brought out the Rosicrucian aspect of this deeply Christian aspect of this, was Johann Valentin André. He was the one who wrote the Rosicrucian manifestos. Those are easy to find on the internet or in book form, and they were anonymously published in the early 17th century, and it set Europe in an uproar, claiming that there is a secret society called the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, who, if you had the capability of finding them, could teach you all sorts of things about science and spirituality. It was basically an invitation to changing the way you think about science and religion, and they offered such things like teaching you how to heal the way Jesus healed, teaching you how to speak any language without having to learn the language, and promising that it would be a much more fulfilling life than basic materialistic scientific inquiry or the dogmatic superstitions of Orthodox Church. And most historians believe that this was just a hoax that Johann Valentin André perpetrated against society. It was just some big running joke that he just wanted to rattle everyone's cages. He wanted to piss off the scientists and the priests. He just wanted to get under everybody's skin. And I mean, that did happen. I don't know if that was his intention. The historians seem to think it was, because that did happen. Honestly, I don't think it was a hoax. It doesn't really make sense. People say that the personality named Christian Rosenkreutz, who Johann Valentin André writes about in a fiction that he wrote called The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, they said that it was just a made-up character. Now, obviously, André's version of it is highly fictionalized. It's very allegorical. Rudolf Steiner claims that Christian Rosenkreutz was a real person who lived in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, and he traveled around the Near East seeking knowledge, and he got some sort of knowledge, it's unknown, from Arab mystics who were likely among the original Christians from Damascus and around Palestine. And when he gained this knowledge, he went back to Central Europe and started teaching it. And then it's said that he lived to be like over 100 years old or something like that. He died and was entombed, and it was said that his tomb would be opened after about 100 years. And that is when, André and the other Rosicrucians began writing in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. They claim that they opened the tomb of Christian Rosenkreutz, and they got a wealth of knowledge from him. And this really changed the face of European science and philosophy, the Rosicrucian stream. Scientists are loath to admit this. They will never admit it because you know how scientists are when it comes to Christianity. They hate it. They don't want to think about it. They hate the fact that Isaac Newton wrote more theological literature than scientific literature. They hate the fact that Johann von Goethe saw glowing balls of light in the forests, and that's what made him want to become a scientist. And they hate the fact that he wrote poetry called Rosicrucian poetry. Even von Goethe himself called his poetry Rosicrucian. He was fully aware of this Christian mystic theme. And, you have the green snake and the white lily, which was a poet by von Goethe, and that's a deeply Christian and mystic poem. And then he became, one of the greatest scientists who ever lived. He has his theory of color, he has his morphology of plant life, his theories of light, that are very different from Isaac Newton's theories of color and light. And in fact, artists today, or paint manufacturers, people who make paint pigments, actually use Goethe's theory of color, because Isaac Newton's isn't actually true. It doesn't actually work. If you consider white light to be like a sack of colors that just has all the 7 colors and you can split them up, you can kind of pull the colors out of white light, you actually cannot make paint pigments using this philosophy. It doesn't work. But Goethe's theory is that the higher frequency range of the colors, like, kind of green and above, that's what light looks like when you look at it through darkness. So say you looked at light through a dark medium, you would get the higher frequency colors. The lower frequency colors, like, lower green to red and below, that's what darkness looks like when you look at it through light. This is totally different from what physics claims color is, and it's totally different from what Isaac Newton claims color is. But talk to any paint manufacturer, and they will tell you that Newton's theory doesn't work. So that's very interesting. So obviously, Rosicrucian philosophy has a more practical grounding, more practical use than materialistic science. It's very, very interesting to realize how much of an impact that has on just our practical mundane world. So aside from Johann Valentin André and Johann von Goethe pissing off the whole world, you had an earlier philosopher named Jacob Boehme, and he received mystic revelations from the Holy Spirit when he was younger, and he would write these and publish them, and he got into a lot of trouble with the Catholic Church. They excommunicated him, and they tried to censor him and get him to stop publishing his books. He didn't. He kept doing it, and thank God he did. We have his books like The Way to Christ, Signatura Rerum, or The Signature of All Things, which is like his natural philosophy, and Aurora, which is his sort of mystic cosmology. He even drew. He was an artist. He was very good with the pen. He has a few other books like The Threefold Man, which probably inspired Rudolf Steiner. And, you know, Jacob Boehme went real deep. And his philosophy does not contradict Christianity, as the Orthodox and Protestant and Catholic churches would like you to believe. Not at all. What bothered them about it was that he proved that you don't need a priest, and you don't need these intermediaries getting between you and Christ. That you can have a relationship with Christ on your own, that you do not need to go through some cult or some priest. You can engage the Holy Spirit by yourself with your own heart and mind. And he proved it very sufficiently in his writings which were revealed to him by the Holy Spirit, according to the stories and according to your faith. And that's why they tried to censor him, because they're basically he was basically gonna put them out of a job. So Jacob Boehme, he was a tour de force of German mysticism, and really breathed the Christian life into the scientific community against their will, but he did it, and we're still inspired by him to this day. Now there was another German who had a huge impact on the Western world, and that's George von Welling. There's his name down there. And here's an extremely long title of a book that he wrote. And this book, yeah, look at all that's all part of the title. This book inspired all of the occult societies of the 19th and 20th centuries, like some degrees of Freemasonry, the Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley, for better or worse, was inspired by that book. There were many 19th and 20th century mystics and philosophers and scientists who were inspired by George von Welling. He was an alchemist, a scientist, a mystic, an astronomer, a theologian. He kind of did a little bit of everything, and it mostly inspired the world of ritual magic. But again, he was a Christian, and as difficult as it is for a lot of Christians to accept, his teachings do not contradict the Bible. They do not contradict the New Testament. They do not contradict the teachings of Christ. I know, people think ritual magic and Christ cannot go together. They can. If you would just think clearly and set your dogma and fear-mongering aside, you would see that they are compatible. Not that you need to do it. It's very involved. It's very time-consuming. It's quite childish to perform ritual magic, to be perfectly frank. So I'm definitely not encouraging you to go do it. I'm not saying it's necessary for your spiritual life to become a ritual magician. I'm just saying it's not this crazy evil thing that people think it is. It can be, but it's just like fire. You know, magic power is just like fire. You can cook a nutritious meal with it, or you can burn down your neighbor's house with it. It's up to you how it's used. It's not inherently evil. Fire is not an evil thing just because it can burn you. Without fire, you'd still be eating raw meat and speaking in grunts, living in caves. So, take it or leave it. Magic is not incompatible with Christianity. Now, what this Rosicrucian thinking led to in the early 17th century was the publication of what historians have come to call the ideal states, books about the ideal state. There were a few of these books published about what like the best society would be, these sort of utopian treatises. And they're generally written kind of like a fictional narrative to show like what these great cities would be like. And it was just easy to do it in a narrative form instead of in some obnoxious political treatise. And of course, in 1551 you have Sir Thomas More's Utopia. That's where the word comes from. Now, Thomas More was not a Rosicrucian. And his Utopia, even though it's technically lumped in with the other ideal state books of that time period, is not a Rosicrucian idea. namely because his utopia depends on slavery. And that is not a Christian belief. Remember, it's the Christian world that ended slavery in the 19th century. So he's not a Rosicrucian because he believes slavery is necessary for a utopia. And he also staunchly defended the Catholic Church during the Protestant Reformation. But the other books on the ideal states, almost all were Rosicrucian. In 1619, you again have Johann Valentin André, and he wrote his book Christianopolis. This was about a Christian republic and how the city would be laid out and how the politics would work. And it is almost exactly like Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, which was written in 1623, published in 1627. New Atlantis is another Rosicrucian manifesto, or ideal state text. Francis Bacon, of course, was a Rosicrucian. And Christianopolis and the New Atlantis are almost exactly the same. There are these sailors, their boats get basically shipwrecked, they wash up onto this country they've never seen before, and then it turns out to be like this great country with ruled by deeply Christian scientists, and they're shown around at how their economy works, how they gain scientific and mystical knowledge, how their government works, how everyone is well fed and taken care of, and how people are taught to take care of themselves, rather. And it's strange how similar those two books are. It's like Francis Bacon wrote his for the English-speaking world and the French-speaking world, and Valentin André wrote basically the same version, but in German and more available to Central and Eastern Europeans. Is that just a coincidence? Did they organize it together? These are mysteries. This is part of the mysteries of the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. These things happened around the same time, yet there wasn't any clear paper trail, no letters of correspondence between these personalities, yet they all published these extraordinarily similar texts and ideas around the same time. Another one was Tommaso de Campanella. He wrote his book called Civitas Solis, or The City of the Sun. Again, the same thing, a deeply Christian book on how to lay out a city and a republic according to Christian science. And in fact, it was adopted by King Louis I'm going to say the 14th, but don't quote me on that. And they actually started to redesign Paris based on Campanella's ideas. And that is described in great detail in a book by Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval called Talisman. This book not only serves as probably the best and most comprehensive history of the Gnostics, but it is also an extremely comprehensive history of the layout of the city of Paris. And you will see how it is laid out like Luxor and Heliopolis of Egypt. Again, Heliopolis, that's Greek for the city of the sun. You have on the top here, you've got the layout of Paris, and just below that you have Luxor in Egypt. And that is showing what they call the historical axis that kind of goes east-west through the center of Paris. It goes from the entrance of the Louvre, the museum with the pyramid in front of it, through an obelisk that is in the middle of an intersection, and then all the way over to the Grand Arch in the west, which I'm sure you've seen pictures of, the giant Grand Arch. And then there is that little 26-degree deviation that's kind of going south there. It's not exactly east-west, and you'll see that the cathedral on the Seine Island in the middle of the river, its entrance is at that same sort of 26 degrees. And that's really weird because the east-west axis, of course, is where the sun will rise and set during the summer and winter solstices, but that 26-degree offset is where the sun rises and sets on May 8th and August 6th. Those are important Christian holidays. On May 8th, you have what was commemorating the apparition of the archangel Michael, who showed up on a bunch of mountaintops. Apparently, a big apparition of him showed up on a bunch of mountaintops throughout Europe in the 5th century A.D. And so May 8th is a feast day commemorating that appearance of that apparition. And August 6th, of course, is celebrated throughout the Christian world, even to this day. The May 8th holiday is not so much celebrated anymore, but the August 6th is the feast of the Transfiguration of Christ, when Christ brought Peter, James, and John up, I believe it was Mount Hermon, where he saw these apparitions of Elijah and Moses, and Christ was transfigured, and he was made to emanate light from his body. And so you have these monuments in Paris that are lined up with the sun at those days. So you have these Rosicrucian themes throughout European society. What does this have to do with Slavic people, right? That's a pretty deep discussion, and it's not exactly easy to get from point A to point B talking about these things because of how the Rosicrucian stream works in society. So I would definitely need to clarify what the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross is. I keep talking about this Rosicrucian stream that influences these philosophers. Now, what exactly is that? Of course, the conspiracy theorists love to say that it is an actual brotherhood, an organized hierarchy of individuals who, they're like some organized branch of the Illuminati or something like that. You can look at the 18th degree of Scottish Rite Freemasonry and some degrees of the other rites of Freemasonry that they call it the degree of the Rosy Cross. You have the American Organization of the Rosy Cross, or AMORC. You have the Golden Dawn, who claims to be, they call themselves the Brotherhood of the Golden and Rosy Cross. But, I can call myself a giraffe, it doesn't make me a giraffe. Just because these people have taken the name of the Rosy Cross and have applied it to their degrees and groups doesn't make it true. It just doesn't make it true. I believe that this is a historical deception. Not to say that there haven't been Rosicrucians in these orders. Statistically speaking, these secret societies have had so many members that a few of them are bound to be authentic Rosicrucians. But they are not an organized secret society the way conspiracy theorists would have you believe. And then, of course, the historians will tell you that they don't exist at all, which, of course, the truth is somewhere between the two. They're organized in a mystic sense, in an intuitive sense. Like, you could be a Rosicrucian and not even know it. If you gain your inspiration from the Archangel Michael, or Michael, you're technically a Rosicrucian. That's the organization, that's the hierarchy. It's not a group of people like, some Illuminati group giving out orders to all these philosophers and scientists and artists. It's people who are inspired by the cosmic hierarchy, by the spiritual powers of the world. And that means that the Rosicrucians are not organized. Perhaps that explains why Francis Bacon, Valentin André, and Tommaso Campanella were able to write these books about the ideal Christian state, why they're all written in a very similar narrative form, and they're written in different languages at all around the same time. Did they organize it, or were they just inspired at the same time by the same spiritual impulses? Is kind of like how the light bulb was invented by like 12 people around the world within a year. It's kind of like how the cotton gin was invented by 3 different people around the world within a few months. There are all these moments of spontaneous, simultaneous invention, and we don't claim that the bunch of people who invented the light bulb around the same time were conspiring to invent the light bulb. No, they had a spiritual impulse that all led to them doing it at the same time. Historians can't stomach that sort of crap because, they have that sort of pics or it didn't happen kind of philosophy. No one ever wrote about it, so therefore it doesn't exist. That is such a closed-minded way, and I've had this argument with so many historians and so many college professors. They literally believe that if somebody didn't write about it, it didn't happen, because if it was important, someone would have wrote about it. What kind of a closed-minded way of thinking is that? And then the conspiracy theorists, they see the word Rosicrucian or Rosy Cross written all over the place in all these different ways, and they just take it at face value. They say, oh, the Rosicrucians are in the Freemasons, or they're in the Illuminati, or, they're the real power behind the Great White Brotherhood and the New World Order because I read Rosicrucian on a book about Freemasonry one day. And they go no deeper than that and think they found like the deepest truth of the Rosicrucians, which is ridiculous. They're organized by the cosmic hierarchy. And most Rosicrucians don't ever know that they're Rosicrucians. They just don't figure it out. It's not important that they know. It doesn't really matter. You're intuitively inspired to think and do certain things in your life. Your goals line up with the other Rosicrucians who are inspired by the same spiritual impulse, and there you go. There's your Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. It is not organized. It has no hierarchy. It has no human hierarchy. It has a spiritual hierarchy. And that's why it is so difficult to track down this brotherhood. That is why it is a subject of so much conspiracy theory. And it's also why it is reviled and hated, because it cannot be tracked down. The enemies of the Rosicrucians cannot defeat them. Like, you're going to go to war with freaking archangels? It's not going to work. Like, they're an invincible brotherhood because of their support from the spiritual world. They're invisible and invincible. And that's why there's so much crap talked about them, because the dark brotherhoods, the enemies of humanity, they hate the Rosicrucians, and they want you to hate them too. So they will use the reverse psychology through the conspiracy theorists and get you to hate the Rosicrucians, so that you turn your backs on this important spiritual impulse. The spiritual impulse that has given us modern medicine, it has given us modern science, it has given us modern architecture, it has given us the music of Bach and Mozart and Beethoven and Kernberger. It has given us some of the greatest advancements we've ever had, and it led to, Rudolf Steiner himself, who was, people call him the last of the Rosicrucians, because after he was murdered, it became underground again. The Rosicrucian stream was forced underground again by capitalists, by the communists, and by the Nazis and fascists. The 20th century it was like the 30 Years' War all over again. It just drove Rosicrucianism right back underground. And now it is ridiculed and reviled like it once was in the past, which is a terrible tragedy. This is how it connects with the Slavic people. This is my segue into the destiny of the Slavic people, the other talking point of this video. In my last video, I discussed the 7 post-Atlantean epochs and how we are in the 5th epoch, which Steiner called it the modern epoch. My opinion is that in the future, it will be called the Anglo-American epoch. Maybe it'll be called the Western European epoch, but I think it'll be called the Anglo-American epoch, or perhaps just the English epoch. And the 6th epoch, Steiner hinted, is going to be the Slavic epoch. That the Slavic people have to step into their destiny for the sake of the human race, for the benefit and the evolution of our spiritual nature. That the Slavic people will be the next dominant culture for the next 2,000 or 3,000 years or so. That is why that the German mysticism is so important, because Central Europe acts as a mediary between the Western world and the Eastern world, or at least the Eastern European and Slavic world. Then, of course, you have the Russians and the Slavs, they're like another layer. They're like a mediary between the West and the East at large. So the German world and Eastern European world has this important role to play in making sure that the Slavic people are allowed to receive the full benefit of the spiritual impulses that are bringing us into the 6th post-Atlantean epoch. The 6th post-Atlantean epoch is to be a deeply Christian epoch, according to the Rosicrucians. In the book of Revelations and in the Orthodox world, you have this idea of the so-called second coming of Christ. The Rosicrucians teach that it's not like this big momentous event. Like there's not going to be a bunch of Jesus UFOs falling from the sky and everyone's going to see like this great second coming and the earth is going to shake or any crap like that. That's a very, very weird interpretation of the book of Revelations. Doesn't necessarily support that view. Steiner and the Rosicrucians teach that the second coming of Christ is happens on an individual basis when a person is prepared, sufficiently mentally, emotionally, and spiritually prepared to receive the vision of the Christ. Christ will then appear to that person in his etheric body, or, you know, which is like, it's basically like manifesting like a physical body in front of you that probably only you'd be able to see. If there are other people around who were not sufficiently prepared to see this vision, they probably wouldn't see him. And so that's the second coming of Christ. It happens to thousands of people every week around the world. He said it was going to start happening near the end of the 20th century. That was going to happen more and more and more, and more people were going to be sufficiently prepared for this visitation from Christ. And as that really ramps up over the next few centuries, that's like laying the groundwork for the sixth post-Atlantean epoch, or the Slavic Epoch. Once the Western world is sufficiently spiritualized, then the Slavic people will be able to do what it is that they have to do, which Rudolf Steiner was never clear about. I think it's because it was probably too controversial to talk about, so he never lectured on it. He probably had clear ideas of it, because a contemporary of his took this idea a lot further and actually lectured and wrote books on it. So Steiner probably felt like he didn't have to, because of a Russian philosopher and mystic named Vladimir Soloviev. He wrote a doctrine on the universal church, not the Catholic Church. I know Catholic is Latin for universal, but Soloviev believed that the Catholic Church was doomed because of its decadence in materialism and politics. Because it was not a spiritual institution, he said it was an archaeological relic. That's how he described it. He called the 7 ecumenical councils completely uninteresting to the common folk, that only intellectuals and ecclesiastics would study the 7 ecumenical councils. And having a faith based on these ancient councils that are more than 1,200 years old is not based in love. It's not based in anything spiritual. It's just political games is what it is in his opinion. And so he believed that when the Catholic Church collapsed, which he believed was inevitable, he wrote a prophecy about it called like A Story of the Antichrist, I think it was called. And in that story, the Catholic Church disappears. That there would be a new universal church that would be born from within Russia and the Slavic people. And that this would be a church based on truth and love, and not based on politics or economics or any of the crap that the Catholic Church built itself on. You know, crowning kings and trading in political favors and allowing royal families to pay to become bishops and stuff like that. That in Soloviev's view, the new Slavic Church would be universal, and it would appeal to everyone on the planet, and it would unify the planet based on love and understanding and mutual respect. And he wrote, I think, like 7 books on this subject. You can then see in the 20th century, late 19th century, and throughout the 20th century, all the way up to today, and it's ramping back up today, all this anti-Slavic hatred, this anti-Russian crap that's been going on. You know, you had, of course, anyone with a brain in their head knows that World War I was a conspiracy to destroy the Tsar and to destroy Russia, to kill 55 million Russians over the course of 30 years through Bolshevism, or, you know, what we call like communism. That was the very purpose of World War I. You know, there were maps being thrown around in old magazines in the 1890s talking about how Russia needs to become a desert, how the kingdoms of Europe need to be destroyed and turned into republics. And then it happened. So whoever was writing these old magazines, the precursor to Foreign Affairs magazine and all of those, they have their little maps. Their little maps of how they wanted to carve up the world. And then, 10, 20, 30 years later, the world was carved up almost exactly according to these maps that were published in these magazines. There's a book by Terry Boardman called Mapping the Millennium. I highly recommend that book, especially if you're interested in the whole New World Order conspiracy research. Mapping the Millennium by Terry Boardman is an excellent book, and it describes these magazines and this propaganda that was used in elite circles and how the world has been shaped by it. Their Foreign Affairs magazine also made maps in the 1930s that then reflected the world in the 1950s. And then in 1990, I believe it was, there was another map that came out in The Economist magazine, which broke the world up into ideological sectors. And it was very reminiscent of George Orwell's 1984. And now you see these ideological sectors actually exist. You have like Confuciania, which is like the Asian world, and you have Hindustan, which is the Indian world. Then you have like the Anglo-American world, and then you have like the Slavic world, and then you have the Islamic world. And that is pretty much how the world had been divided since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So who's ever making these magazines is trying to divide up the world, and they're trying to keep the Slavs out of the Western world. So what have they done? They've created institutions like NATO and the European Union and these other types of World Trade Organization and trade agreements that have swallowed up Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, NATO keeps expanding as far east as it could, especially in the 1980s and 90s. NATO swallowed up all of Eastern Europe so that they could prevent Eastern Europe and Central Europe from being the intermediaries, the mediation between the Slavs and the Western world. The Western world swallowed them up with materialistic trade agreements and ideals of liberal democracy and kept them away from the rest of the Slavic world. It kept them thoroughly engaged in Western economics and Western politics so that they could not achieve the Slavic destiny that the Rosicrucians know is necessary for the future of the human race. And this is a terrible tragedy. I mean, when you look at a country like Montenegro and how embroiled it is in Western civilization, when it should be more associated with Slavic civilization. It's part of the WTO, it's part of NATO, it's part of the EU, it's part of all these agreements. And a long time ago, there was a Tibetan prophecy uncovered saying that the Kundalini of the world would move to the land of the Midnight Mountain. Now, the Kundalini of the world, that's like an energy that erupts from the invisible aspect of the earth through a certain geographical location. And for thousands of years, it had been coming out of the Himalayan mountain range. And that's why India is considered to be such a spiritual place, because it had this spiritual energy that could, help your intuition and your clairvoyance develop faster. But this, I believe it was a 17th or 18th century Tibetan prophecy saying that energy was going to then move to the land of the Midnight Mountain. And I think this is why you have the Central European mystics, these German mystics from the 16th to the 18th centuries, who were so deep and spiritual, because the land of the Midnight Mountain could be Montenegro, the Black Mountain, where the granite is black and the trees have a very dark green color. That's where it gets its name. And the Western world, who is largely influenced by the Dark Brotherhoods, the enemies of the Rosicrucians and the enemies of humanity, have politically and economically absorbed Montenegro and other Eastern European countries to prevent this sort of spiritual awakening from happening, because they would rather have a very materialistic world order instead of a spiritual world order, because they can have power over you if you don't believe in the soul, you only care about economics and politics, then they can control you. But of course, if you believe in God, if you believe in Christ, if you believe in the Spirit, they can't control you. Your government is God's government, your law is God's law, and so they cannot control you if you don't believe in their authority. And that's what I think is the real driving force behind all of the cataclysm that has been the 20th century and the continued and resurging anti-Russian hatred and propaganda that you see throughout Western Europe and America. It is to prevent a spiritual awakening and to prevent the destiny of the Slavic people, because the destiny of the Slavic people is really the destiny of all people. What the Slavic people do or don't do will determine the next stage of evolution for the human race. And if they are prevented from their spiritual awakening, then the rest of the world will also be prevented from that. I will have a whole video on where I think that impulse comes from and where it's leading. So make sure you check in for that. This will conclude this lecture. I hope it was stimulating. I hope it clarified a few ideas about Western Christianity and how, as long as you can consider the Rosicrucian stream as being truly authentic Christianity, you will see that it doesn't require Eastern mysticism to add to it, that Christianity doesn't actually lack any mystical science. If you study the Rosicrucian stream, you'll see, the 7 churches and lamps of the apocalypse can easily be interpreted as the 7 chakras. Many New Agers believe that Christianity and Western thought lacks a spiritual dimension, or the spiritual sciences. It doesn't. It's just hidden and obscured, but it is there. You don't need to introduce anything from the East to enhance Christianity. Christianity is complete. It's just that the scientific aspects of the spiritual nature of the human being is just more obscured and difficult to decode, but it is all there, and the Rosicrucians have revealed that sufficiently to us. I hope it doesn't offend anyone. I'm sure it has. I'm sure this video has offended some people, but I'm just reporting what I think has been going on, and I think it's important that we get to grips with this, because the future is at stake, and we need to start thinking more clearly about these things that go under everybody else's radar. Hopefully my next few videos will be a bit more lighthearted and interesting. So check back, tune in again, and thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.